At the time when this one was set, in the 1870s, the richest man in the South Island, possibly New Zealand, was farming magnate William Robinson. Born in 1814, Robinson's 85,000-acre run at Cheviot, a 90-minute drive north of Christchurch, allowed him the trappings of a wealthy man in the era, even by today's standards. A massive mansion, regular trips to England, and servants to boot. The mixture of those staff, as you're about to find out, ended up being incendiary. That mansion in the Cheviot Hills was at the time the second largest in New Zealand, well able to accommodate his 5 daughters. They did have a son, by the way, but he died young, and between them 5 to 7 staff at any given time. Their very English roles range from nurse, governess through to butler. One of the other interesting features of his setup in Cheviot was he had a wharf constructed where wool could be exported directly overseas rather than transported to Christchurch. Moored to it was his 37-foot pleasure launch. William Robinson had 2 nicknames: Ready Money, because of his propensity to flash his cash around town. The other one was the Lord of Cheviot Hills. He had fingers in a lot of pies, and that required regular domestic travel. Besides managing the largest farm in New Zealand, he was on the Nelson Provisional Council and had interests in horse breeding and racing. At times this made Cheviot, for a journey from Christchurch at the time, an awkward place to be based out of, particularly now Eliza, his wife, had become ill and was under specialist medical care. Accompanied by his wife, children and staff, he also rented a large house in the middle of Christchurch, which no longer stands. All we have now is a sketch. Amongst the servants in tow and in residence in Christchurch were a number of new immigrants from Ireland: Catherine Glynn, a scullery maid, and her cousin Maggie Burke, a cook. The most striking servant, however, was their butler, Simon Cadino, a Negro they had acquired in Panama on their way back from England. It was trendy in the European era to have a United Nations of servants. Reliable and hard-working, Cadino was sadly a square peg in a round hole under the Robinsons' roofs. For starters, the Panamanian's first language was Spanish. He also exhibited a rebellious streak, resulting in Old Man Robinson berating him in the most demeaning fashion. That's one word that I can't mention out loud without attracting the wrath of YouTube censors. Sing it a dozen times though in a rap song, and that's okay. Cadino was known to fly off the handle, and therefore Mr. Robinson kept him on a short leash. At this stage of the game, it was open season on Simon Cadino. Joining in the taunts and baiting were the fellow staff members Catherine Glenn, Maggie Burke and Bridget Murray. They took it to a new level when they found out Cadino was rumoured to be engaged to an Irish lass. This didn't go unnoticed by the Robinsons, who, along with their Catholic parish priest, told them to put a sock in it. Mrs. Robinson was a more circumspect of the couple, and being around the home more, she had a fair idea of who was stirring things up. Everyone had seen Cadino fly off the handle on certain occasions. No one knew exactly what set Cadino off that Monday morning. It was business as usual in the household. Mr. Robinson was out of town. Mrs. Robinson and the girls were entertaining a guest, when suddenly Catherine Glynn found her hair being sharply yanked from behind, staring at a maniacal-looking butler wielding a large knife, screaming out, "Oh, merciful Jesus!" and putting her arms up defensively. Cadino slashed her face and then began frantically stabbing her, the blows entering her chest. Blood loss resulted in her losing consciousness in seconds. Collapsed on the scullery floor, Cadino looked down at Glenn, and thinking she was dead, it was time to set his sights on his second target. Metres away in the kitchen, and aware of the kerfuffle, was Margaret, or Maggie, Burke, who was faced with a blood-splattered, knife-wielding Cadino. If his motives weren't already obvious, his turn to do the taunting made them patently clear. Maggie hightailed it next door into the dining room, where Eliza and the 5 girls, and technically women, the oldest was 21, were sedately having afternoon tea with Patrick Campbell, a family friend. And pursuing a terrified and screaming Burke, Cadino was focused on his next victim, babbling away in a combination of Spanish and English. Campbell leapt to restrain Cadino. Whilst he could deflect some of the blows raining down on Margaret Burke, others met their mark, piercing her abdomen. "You will kill her, you brute," protested Campbell, to which he was greeted with a zombie-like, "Yes, I will kill," and continued on with the attack. In the same room, of course, was Eliza Robinson and her children. Rather than panic, she took stock of the situation and ordered the 3 youngest to go to their bedrooms and lock themselves in. They would ultimately shelter Catherine Glen. That poor lady would never be the same. The older 2 were told to get more manpower in the form of their groom, Price. The next move was one that took a lot of courage. Eliza Robinson joined the fray, trying to subdue Cadino and getting a cut to her hand in the process. Then broke off the scrum and confronted him in a loud voice. "Give me the knife, Cadino," which seemed to somehow awaken him from his trance-like state. "I give the knife to you, ma'am." Mrs. Robinson took it from his hand and put it on the sideboard. Meanwhile, Price and Campbell had joined in together and subdued Cadino. The mortally wounded Margaret Burke rose from her chair that she had been pinned to and took a few steps before collapsing to the floor, dead. And soon on the scene was a doctor from a few doors down, who attended to both maids. For one, it was too late, and Price and Campbell literally marched him the 250 metres down to the central police station, where he was promptly arrested. Price's entry onto the scene was to be telling in the forthcoming trial. He had a grasp of Spanish and was able to tell the jury Cadino had ranted along the lines, in a mixture of Spanish and English. When the public found out what had happened, there was outrage. The funeral for Margaret Burke was attended by over 500, laid to rest at the Barbadoes Street Cemetery. The public would get their wish, and justice would be swift. Cadino would be found guilty and sentenced to hang. Not before a number of ghoulish and odd things occurred in the preceding 3 months between the murder trial and execution. Cadino was led by the police to inspect the dead body of Burke residing in their morgue. His demeanour over this custodial period went from one extreme to the other, claiming at one end of the spectrum that if Mr. Robinson had been there that day, he would have started on him, and that the other maid, Bridget Murray, was also on his hit list, only she was upstairs at the time. Then in the next breath, everyone should take into account that he was a top worker. Then there were the bouts of incoherent mumbling, undertaking a hunger strike claiming he was stitched up, 2 suicide attempts whilst in prison. Therefore, probably by modern standards, it's fair to say he was suffering some sort of psychosis. What happened to old man Robinson in all of this? He was feeling rather responsible for the whole affair. In September, a guilt-ridden Robinson funded an overdue headstone for Burke. Being poor and all but alone in a new country up to this point, she had been buried in an unmarked grave. With her Catholic upbringing, the mason had carved into the stone the design of a Sacred Heart. Skip forward 4 decades, the murder and execution were long forgotten. War was brewing in Europe when a ghoulish story was released. A gravestone at the Barbadoes Cemetery gave the appearance of emitting a red blood-like substance. The headstone was that of Margaret Burke. The actual headstone is the one on your screen, with my poetic license transposed. For the next half a century, Margaret Burke's headstone monument became the go-to scary site for bored Christchurch teenagers, a macabre tourist site. Attempts were made to remediate the stone by the Christchurch City Council to reduce nighttime larrikins and unwanted punters. Alas, with no real aesthetic changes, the red stain, or strain, still remained ingrained. In 1961, vandals deliberately broke the gravestone in order to steal the offending reddened patch, the result of which is on your screen. The council took the remnants away with a view at some point of patching it all up together. This never happened. Skip forward to 1998, when the subject of the bleeding headstone came into the news again as a result of a television series, the rather appropriately named Epitaph. They had got wind of the story and were wanting to conclude it in a series, only they were short one critical piece of the story. Where was the headstone, or what remained of it? The public were asked, and perhaps they knew the guilty parties. Given the passage of time, they would spill the beans on what happened to the missing crucial piece. At the same time, what happened to the surviving pieces that were supposed to have been placed in safe storage by the council. And both those avenues turned up nothing. And to this day, we don't know what happened to the gravestone. Rather sadly as well, even the exact location of the grave has been obscured, a status that is likely to remain so forevermore. All we have left today, therefore, are a single set of black and white photos and newspaper reports to ponder. The legend I've outlined, which I've done my best to preserve. Thanks for tuning into my amateur hobby channel today, featuring interesting and quirky happenings from NZ, like the tale of the unscrupulous American Arthur Worthington, who duped Christchurch citizens in the 1890s into supporting his wacky religion, also taking their clothes off and rolling about on the floor of his lounge along with his wife, Mrs. Worthington. The puritanical YouTube never gave this video any traction because it had the naughty word SEX in the title. Perhaps you can give it a bump along, a smidgen. Do come back next time. Bye for now.